Hello, everyone. My name is Chiara Palladino. It is my pleasure to introduce the speaker for the first of the Material Digital Humanities seminars for this spring in 2025. The Material Digital Humanities seminars are a recurrent event, and they're organized for this year by Gabi Bodard at the Digital Humanities Research Hub at the University of London, and myself, Chiara Palladino, at the Department of Classics in Furman University. So for today, we have our first speaker, and it is my honor and my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Kahn, who is a Marie Curie postdoc at the University of Vienna. She will present on an incredibly exciting topic with a fantastic title, Skulls, Skin and Names, the ethics of managing heritage collections data online. So Becca, the floor is yours. Please feel free to start whenever you like.
Thank you, Chiara. And thank you both for the invitation to be here. Our paths have crossed for a long time, both Gabi and you and I, and it's really lovely to be back in a virtual room with the two of you after all of these years of tangential connections. I'm going to share my screen quickly. Let's hope I can get it right. One moment. It's the classic Zoom. Give me a second. And let's do that. And we're good. Excellent. Thank you. So I've also just realized that since we had our conversation right before we started, I have used the incorrect title for the seminar today. Apologies. Before I send you the slides, I will change that. I have also updated the kind of subtitle of this talk today because I think we really are dealing with ethical time bombs in collections when we think about these objects and these materials. And it's important for all of us who work in these fields and who think about these types of materials to think about them in such a way. What I'm going to do today is start with a little bit of introduction and scene setting, and to talk a little bit about museum data, what it is, what its affordances and challenges are. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some case studies, and then ask some questions and hopefully leave you with some provocations. And unfortunately, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to leave you with any answers, but I think the sign of a good seminar is to come away with as many questions as you maybe began with, but perhaps slightly different questions. So a short introduction. My name is Rebecca Kahn. I'm a postdoc at the University of Vienna. I'm in the history department, although I'm not a historian. I'm in deep cover here. My real background is actually in digital humanities, and specifically in the kind of what we would now call digital heritage, I suppose, but in the kind of museum, archive, and library studies side of DH. And I'm going to start talking, first of all, about museums and museum data. So museums are inherently data-centric institutions. And depending on the type of museum, they may hold numerical data concerning the bone density of dinosaurs. They may hold data related to the chemistry of mineralogical specimens, financial data related to the art market value of their collections, geographic and archaeological data, which helps to describe a collection of Neolithic pottery. And in addition to all of this highly specialized data, it's almost certain that they also hold a great deal of textual information describing all of their objects, their provenance, and their history within the institution. And we need to consider this at the scale of hundreds of thousands or even millions of objects for some of the largest museums out there. Museums also collect visitor data via social media, via ticketing systems, via gift shop sales data, and in-gallery observations. And this might include audio and video recordings. And then thirdly, they also hold collections data. So that is the information about each and every object, its storage location and conditions, each and every preservation treatment it is subject to, the exhibition and loan history of every object, as well as bibliographies of any research texts which make reference to these objects. Digitized objects will also often have high-resolution images associated with each data record, and increasingly this includes 3D scans. And all of this is just the objects that have been accessioned, cataloged, and digitized. One of the things that people don't often talk about is the proportion of museums' collections which have not even been recorded yet and And many of these collections consist of an abundance of uncatalogued and undescribed objects sitting in storage boxes. And as much as I would like to talk about those objects, because it's a topic particularly close to my heart, for the purposes of today's talk, I'm going to mostly focus on the first and the third data types I described. And since this seminar is specifically focused on digital humanities and materiality, I'm going to discuss the affordances and pitfalls of using semantic networks and knowledge graphs for cultural heritage data, what this might mean for how we think about these objects, their material realities, and the ethical questions raised by their presence in the databases we work with. But what this will require is stepping back a few hundred years in order to get a sense of what the stuff that we now call museum data looked like before museums went digital. So in most museums, data started out looking a lot like this. Museums are old. Their collecting practices and systems for recording information have evolved over decades and sometimes even hundreds of years. Historically, museum records were stored in physical ledgers, index cards, accession and inventory books, and often filed along with photographs, letters, sale receipts, exhibition materials, and other types of textual data. Information was recorded by hand, often in the field. So botanists, anthropologists, archaeologists, and other early professional and amateur collectors gathered their specimens. Sometimes records were transferred into typed up ledgers, but not necessarily. And this means that information in many museums is at best idiosyncratic and at worst completely inconsistent. It's also very physically embodied. Interacting with this data meant finding the ledgers it was written in, turning to the correct help, presumably with the help of a finding aid, but not always. Scanning down handwritten or typewritten lists, which were often annotated by different hands, and finding records which were constantly being amended. And this is another important point to remember. Museum records, unlike archival and library records, are not static. They're living objects which change as the research is done on an object, as its exhibition history develops, and as it's subjected to any preservation or conservation practices. It breathes, quite literally, as the object kind of lives through its biography within the institution. Towards the end of the 1960s, in the larger US and UK museums, and often with commercial partners such as IBM, professionals started to think systematically about documenting this information using computer technology, meaning that the material was transcribed, images were scanned, and objects were photographed. Consequently, these materials were stored in databases, which followed a systematic logic, conceptualizing database standards and data formatting. They began to look a lot less analog and a little bit more like what you see here. These are examples of early digitization screens from the British and cards from the British Museum's digitization processes in a truly excellent book. So consequently, these materials were stored in databases following a systematic logic, conceptualizing database standards and data formatting. Early digitization processes were often manual, and it was rare that computers were actually networked. It's also important to note that, though, that often the imperative to transfer records from paper accession books and ledgers was driven as much by the need to clean up records and actually figure out what was in the collection as it was by the possibilities of creating new connections between them. And as an aside, I can't stress enough how important museum collections databases are to managing a museum's holdings. So the stories, which I'm sure many of us are aware of the recent thefts of gemstones in the collection at the British Museum, which it would seem were carried out by one of the museum's curatorial staff, was enabled because the museum's database was the only record of many of these gems. And the investigations have shown that the thief was able to delete these objects from the database, essentially meaning that they officially no longer existed. And some of them hadn't even been accessioned and recorded yet. This means that there's now no record of them ever being part of the collection, and this means that tracking down and reclaiming these stolen gems is almost impossible. But back to the museum digitization. So while the early digitization projects introduced standardization tools for metadata, such as controlled vocabularies and descriptive approaches to standardization for metadata and vocabularies were introduced fairly early, museums are very intransigent places. and many followed their own individual logic for cataloging information, and we'll see why this matters very soon. So, for example, at the British Museum, where I did my PhD research, different departments used different classification systems, which meant that the Department of Prints and Drawings, for example, used different terms to describe objects to those used in, for example, the African collections, which meant that new inclusive fields had to be added to the digital catalogs in order to capture all the information that had been created. And this complexity has a particular significance when we consider how museums embrace the potential of the semantic web as a mechanism for connecting their collections across institutional silos. So I thought at this point, it might be useful to show you a couple of examples of the kind of objects that can be found in the aggregated linked data collections that I've just been talking about, in order to look at the affordances and limits of this approach for connecting heritage collections, and in order to prompt, hopefully, some reflection on the questions about the digital materialities around the objects involved. All of the cases I'm going to discuss today were part of a small study I did in 2023 with my colleague Rainer Simon. We were interested in exploring the ethical questions raised by using linked open data, the data model which makes it possible to build large-scale aggregated online collections for museum materials. And the logical starting point for us was Europeana, which is the portal for digitized cultural heritage in Europe. And it's important here, I think, to say that for many people, Europeana is more than just a digital service. It was launched in the early 2000s and was a flagship project of the European Commission, with the stated purpose of creating a digital cultural heritage portal for Europe. At the time, it was seen as many observers as a counter-response to Google Books' mass digitization of libraries around the world, both in terms of its public nature, in contrast to the anxieties around privatization of cultural heritage that Google Books represented, and its pan-European focus, again, in contrast to the perception that Google Books represented a risk of an American colonization of European culture. Europeana is a space where political, cultural, economic, and technological forces combine into a standalone cultural product, shaped by the processes and politics of mass digitization, and it is an overt manifesto of an imagined shared European identity. And to a certain extent, it's this mass nature of Europeana data that's key, I think, to the discussion today. Dahlstrom, Hansen, and Kellman distinguish between mass digitization and critical digitization in cultural heritage at these processes and their results. And they argue that critical digitization processes are essentially qualitative in nature, manual, and critically recognize the distortion of the data that can take place during digitization and are designed to maximize interpretation in metadata, resulting in digital collections that can be noted for their depth. Mass digitization, on the other hand, is categorized as being primarily automated, designed to treat digitization as a cloning process, minimize the interpretation of metadata, and result in digital collections that are notable for their scale. Neither approach is perfect, of course. Both have benefits and drawbacks, but it's worth noting, and this is something that Dahlstrom and et al. Point out, is that each approach risks falling for the fallacy of exhaustiveness. At the one end of the spectrum, mass digitization approaches conjure up the image of the all-encompassing portal or encyclopedic library, while critical digitization processes create the false illusion of definitiveness, if only it were possible to digitize all the details of an object, supplemented with the most complete and complex metadata possible. Neither, of course, is possible, and I think what we'll see today is that pragmatism and interoperability are more often the deciding factors when it comes to creating digitized resources that sit somewhere between these two poles. It's also important to note at this point that Europeana is not in and of itself a repository of cultural heritage materials. It's always considered its role as an aggregator of digital surrogates, which are ultimately owned by one of the 2,000 providing institutions in Europe. I think it's more than 2,000 now, in fact. Put very simply, institutions who want to add their data into Europeana are required to map it to the Europeana data model. This model just defines the lowest common denominator of descriptive information required to describe an object across domains, formats, and disciplines. But what's important to note is that it's not built on any one particular standard. Rather, it makes use of what Europeana referred to as an open, cross-domain, semantic web-based framework that can accommodate the range and richness of particular community standards, making it appropriate for ingesting data from a range of different museum, archival, or library sources, which may use different metadata schema, including things like Dublin Core or ORE or RDA. What this means is that while the model can include any element, class, or property which is found in the content provider's description, as long as it's possible to provide enough metadata to create a link between the surrogate and the original digital resource on the home institution site, the model can facilitate inclusion. Also, very importantly, all metadata in Europeana is licensed as CC0, meaning it can be reused by anyone without requiring attribution. This is in keeping with general European Commission policy on sharing cultural heritage data. However, this approach has been problematic for many institutions. For many museums, they consider the creation of metadata to be part of their intellectual work, and they're reluctant to share all of this work without any institutional attribution. So as a result, many provide only a restricted amount of their data in CC0, while retaining the balance in their own institutional repositories, using the reasoning that any Europeana user can simply follow the links back to the providing institution's records. What this has actually resulted in, is a stripped down subset of data available in the EDM, and consequently data of inconsistent depth being available on the platform. What this looks like at the most basic level is objects in the portal accompanied by descriptive metadata, a preview image, often a thumbnail, although increased use of the IIIF protocol has made it easier to provide high-resolution images, and a link to the object itself. But it's worth noting that the quality of the metadata supplied by the partner institutions varies very widely, as does the appropriateness of the copyright applied to some of these objects. And as you'll see in the case study, this somewhat hands-off approach means that in some cases, high-resolution images of culturally sensitive materials are licensed under Creative Commons, which actively encourage reuse and sharing. And these images are able to enter the linked data stream with little allowance made for their particularities. And since metadata is not always complete, contextualizing information may be lost, if it was ever available in the first place. It also means that any warning screens or cultural sensitivity warnings, which may be accessible on the providing institution side, are bypassed by the direct URL linking from an item into Europeana. And for sensitive materials where contextualizing metadata is crucial to understanding how, when, and where they were collected and preserved, and under what consequences, the absence of this data can be really critical. It leaves the objects unmoored without the biography that elevates them from being read as curiosities and serves to remind the viewer that they are more than the sum of their parts. The most obvious types of materials for us in the study to turn to, of course, when studying these sorts of issues, are human remains. And this isn't just a question of morbid fascination. In the analog world, the collection, evaluation, storage, and display of human remains are governed by very clear guidelines and ethical frameworks. And in the last decade, many museums have spent a great deal of time, effort, and money on revising how they present their collections that do contain human remains. Laura Peers has written extremely movingly and very poignantly about these processes in museums in her paper Repatriation a Ceremony, which was part of a special issue of the Museum World's Journal on repatriation as ritual. And I think this quote, which I'm not going to read to you, you can read it while I speak, but I think this quote really gives you a sense of how these processes play out side by side, the bureaucratic and the more personal processes, also how carefully managed they have to be. Museums spend a great deal of their time thinking about how to repatriate objects in a way which elevates the process of repatriation from just being a case of making a decision and sending something to another country. In the United Kingdom, the Human Tissue Act and the government's guidance for the care of human remains in museums sets the legal framework and best practice baselines for how institutions should handle, conserve, and display human remains. In Germany, similar guidance is laid out by the 2021 version of the Deutsche Museumsbund's guideline for the care of human remains in museums, including defining what materials are classified as human remains and guidance on how to manage materials collected during colonial expansion or which were acquired during the Nazi period or under the East German regime. In the United States, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, provides the legal and ethical frameworks on the retention, management, and crucially restitution of any human remains and funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony held by any federal institution in the US, including museums, university collections, and local governments. And finally, internationally, the International Council of Museums, or ICOM, sets the standard for the acquisition, research, exhibition, and removal from exhibition of human remains in their code of ethics. However, so you may be surprised to know that no such broadly accepted guidelines exist for managing the digital surrogates of these objects, which reside in databases around the world and which are increasingly being exposed on the open web. And even less guidance is available for how to deal with these digital surrogates when they are mapped into linked or shared repositories and released into the wild online. So for our data harvest of Europeana, we use their search API using various terms related to human remains, such as skull, skeleton, human bone, and human remains. And once we'd filtered the results for objects that were very obviously archaeological and quite surprisingly more religious relics than I had expected to find, we ended up with around 1,494 unique records, which works out to roughly 0.002% of the over 51 million objects in Europeana. Does a fraction of objects this small matter? I think it does, because of the materials we found. Because of the materials we found, several are deeply problematic and some simply should not be accessible at all. So let's have a look at what I'm talking about here. The most striking example of these records which we found are items described as mokomokai, or more accurately, toimoko. These are the preserved heads of Maori people from New Zealand, which often include intricate traditional tattoos and carvings of the skin. As you can see, there's an image which to me is on the far left of the screen, which I have blacked out. This is because toimoko were created as part of funeral rites, treated as objects to be revered, and access to them was restricted. However, after European colonization, interest in toimoko grew very quickly, as did the demand for these objects, and sales of them to European collectors took place quite openly until the 1830s, and their social and economic value shifted from being intimate and personal to commercial and market-driven, particularly when it became possible to trade them for high-value objects such as weapons, alcohol, and tobacco. Now, it's impossible to know quite how many toimoko were transported to European museums, but by looking at repatriation claims for them that have been made over the years, we can see that since 2003, about 400 of these objects have been repatriated from museums in Europe, the US, and Australia. The 4 records that we found in Europeana were from the collection, the Royal Museum of Art and History in Brussels, a collection from the Museum Ethnography in Sweden, and 2 objects from the collections at the State Museums in Berlin. The record from the collection in Brussels provides very little metadata about the object itself. What it does provide, in keeping with Europeana's policy of open access, is a link to download the image, that would be the image that I've blacked out here, at high resolution and under an open license. It's impossible to know the origins of the object, when or under what circumstances it was created or collected, and how it came to be in the collection. None of this information is provided in the accompanying metadata. Viewers can also follow the link back to the providing institution, where again you can see the image, and there is a little more metadata, but not much more. Now, as you can see from the slide, 3 other records were also found, the ones from Berlin and the ones from Sweden. Neither of these records have a corresponding image. Rather, they show a generic outline. The ones from Berlin show a generic outline of a vase with the words aus ethischen Gründen nicht gezeigt, not shown for ethical reasons. Following the link back from Europeana at the moment actually gives a 404 error message, so something's happening with the database on their side. And the fourth record, the one with the gray covering in the slide, from the Ethnographic Museum of Sweden, has also been removed from view. Following the link back to the museum's own collection online, we're first confronted with a sensitivity warning and then find a detailed description of the object, how it was collected, and the date when it was repatriated back to New Zealand. So this is the view of the object in the Belgian collection, and these are the views of the links in the Swedish and in the German collections. And as you can see, there's a sensitivity warning on the Swedish screen, on the screen from the Swedish collection. I think that these four objects demonstrate the spectrum of different approaches to managing sensitive materials in a digital collection, from well-documented removal to no restrictions at all. And I think what this is really a very good example of the bureaucracy that Piers mentions, which happens at the institutional level. There are processes here, and we see here the results of these bureaucratic processes, but there's no ritual, there is no human spirit to be seen here. This is a purely managerial process. The second most significant set of objects that we found in our search were 18 pieces of human skin, which were tattooed with various words and motifs, including French flags, flowers, human figures, and butterflies. And these are part of the Wellcome collection in London. What you see here is a composite of the metadata record and the image that were found in the Europeana search. You'll see there that the creator is the Science Museum and that the objects are at the Wellcome collection. This was because at one point the Science Museum handed a lot of their materials over to the Wellcome. While the descriptive texts accompanying each of these objects describe different details, they all share the same provenance. They were purchased from a Parisian surgeon named Dr. Villette in June 1929. Villette worked in military hospitals during the French conquest of Algeria between 1830 and 1903, and he collected and preserved hundreds of samples from the autopsies of French soldiers. According to the record, Villette was interested in tattoos because they were often seen as markers of criminal tendencies or primitiveness. Whether permission was asked or granted for these fragments to be collected is not specified. In this case, it would seem the desire to collect items which fed a collector's fascination with the criminality and primitivism mentioned in the description seems to have been the driving force behind their acquisition, and the biographies of the men from whom they were collected is all but irrelevant in this process. All 18 of these images are available to download and licensed with open licenses, in this case, a Creative Commons CC BY 4.0 license. Now, I think at this point, I really need to point out that these findings are not intended as a critique of Europeana. Europeana is a platform that aggregates vast amounts of data, which is shared with them by over 3,000 institutions. I think I said 2,000 before, but it's closer to 3,000. This is done via APIs and data dumps, which require constant updating and maintenance if they're to reflect any changes on the side of the providing institution. But it is exactly the scale which is part of the problem, as I see it. When a system is designed to manage millions of objects in as efficient and frictionless a way as possible, it's very difficult to retrospectively identify and remove troublesome materials like these. Without frameworks or guidelines for the management of the digital surrogates of the toimoko and the skin fragments, it's almost impossible to know what the best practice is. Using open licenses is generally seen as something to be encouraged and to work towards. But in this case, the open licenses which enable the sharing of these materials freely online raises serious ethical questions. But applying more restricted licenses would put the providing institutions at odds with Europeana's licensing policies. So we have to sit with this tension and really think about how to manage it. And at the end of the day, we also have to ask, whose responsibility is it to check these collections for problematic material? Is it the providing institutions, the national aggregators? Is it Europeana themselves? The museum in Brussels provides over 30,000 unique objects to Europeana, and the Wellcome collection shares over 90,000. At that scale, locating individual objects would be a time-consuming job, regardless of whose responsibility it is. But what these examples provide us with is an ideal opportunity to think critically about the ethical, legal, and policy issues associated with managing large-scale heritage collections online under increasingly ubiquitous regimes of openness in a way that few other projects do. And it begs the question, I think, as well, is technical capability a good enough reason to digitize and share entire collections? The final set of objects I'm going to show you today are probably the most biography-less, although I find them somehow the most compelling. So when Rainer and I looked at the results of our harvest, we found 8 records for human skulls, again from the Wellcome collection, which were described in the title field as human skulls inscribed with prayers for the deceased, collected by Robert Baden-Powell's Asante, in brackets Ghana, expedition 1895. A manual check using the links in the Europeana, link and EDM is shown at metadata fields, revealed that all 8 objects had the same accession number, A666-427, although it quickly became evident that at least one of these objects was a complete skull, while the other one was only a fragment. After cross-referencing the museum number with records from the Wellcome, we found that there were in fact 2 objects with different museum accession numbers. A666-426 was the cranium fragment, and A666-427 was the complete skull. However, somehow in the Wellcome, and then also in Europeana, these items have become conflated. Both of these objects are covered in text, which has been written or painted onto the bone in a language which appears to be Arabic, although the available metadata does not give us any detail of this or provide any transcript. Whether this detail exists in the catalog is impossible to ascertain without access to the full record, which if you go to the Wellcome collection site, you will see is not available. This is all the metadata you can get. All we have to work with is a title, an image, which is downloadable as a high-resolution JPEG, and some technical metadata describing the licensing. But what we can deduce from their titles and combined with a bit of historical sleuthing is that these 2 objects are part of a very familiar narrative of British imperial violence. The Anglo-Ashanti Wars were a series of conflicts that took place in what is now modern Ghana between 1824 and 1900, between the British Empire and the Ashanti Empire. The Ashanti were a powerful kingdom who came into conflict with the British over access and control of the coastal areas of the region. The 1895 expedition mentioned in the description was led by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Baden-Powell, who many of us will know went on to found the worldwide Boy Scout movement. In her study of the West African collections in the Manchester Museum, Emma Poulter describes how the British forces marched into the Ashanti capital of Kumasi. The Ashanti king, Prempeh, aware that his forces were outnumbered, put up little resistance and accepted what was called at the time British protection, but couldn't pay the fine of 50,000 ounces of gold, which was demanded of the British. So the British forces responded by arresting Prempeh and deporting him to Sierra Leone and then later to the Seychelles, where he was exiled for 28 years. They also ransacked the palace and Prempeh's other residences, which Baden-Powell recorded in his diary at the time. He said, "There could be no more interesting work, no more tempting work than this, to poke about in a barbarian king's palace, whose wealth has been reported very great, was enough to make it so. Here there was a man with an armful of gold-hilt swords. There was one with a box full of gold trinkets and rings, another with a spirit case full of bottles of brandy. There were piles of the tawdriest and commonest stuff, mixed indiscriminately with quaint, old, and valuable articles." Now, with the paucity of metadata available, of course, it's not possible to know with absolute certainty whether the skulls and fragments were taken in this particular moment or at another point in the campaign, or how they came to the Wellcome. But it is significant to place them in the context of the narrative that was often used to describe these expeditions. They were framed as civilizing actions, waged in the name of the salvation of the pagan and the fight against the perceived barbarity of African peoples. These objects illustrate these attitudes perfectly, with no evidence of their use, origin, or sacred purpose provided, or transcriptions or translations of the inscriptions they bear. We risk only seeing them as the collectors did, merely as curiosities, which can be used to justify military actions on moral grounds. So, how do we end this? Where do we go from here? I think there are a couple of ways to think about this. On the one hand, it could be argued that by exposing these sensitive materials, what we actually see is a process of decolonization of museum collections. And Europeana and the providing institutions are providing a significant service by helping to locate and expose much of this material, which might otherwise, due to its relatively low volume, remain hidden in databases. But I think there's another side to this argument. If Europeana's search functionality are to be used as a source of structured data for researchers, including, I may add, those looking for training data for, say, automated algorithmic tools, then there's a question of ethical responsibility. If the Europeana data model is considered too generic and the copyright requirements too open to ensure that museums are willing or able to share their data fully and with deeper contextualizing information, the question has to be asked whether it's appropriate for sensitive heritage materials with deep, deep backstories like these ones to be available via the platform at all. The question also resonates when we consider the linked nature of the data available via Europeana. Sharing materials seamlessly over the web has been the premise and promise of the open web and of the open semantic web, and on the one hand, is increasingly becoming a reality. But just because something can be shared doesn't automatically mean that it should be. And in the absence of guiding principles and best practice rules for digitized human remains and the increasing volume of materials coming online every year, the question of how to manage these collections and objects becomes even more urgent. I also don't believe that wholesale removal of these objects is a viable option either. Firstly, there are the archival and preservational principles of the record, which means that you can't just delete objects from a database. But there is also a question of whether it serves any purpose to just wholesale remove these objects from view. But in a field like digital heritage, where technology is changing and moving faster every day, it can be very difficult to know where to focus our attention. Museum practice has developed over centuries, and digital heritage is just a few decades old. We're still working things out. But I think one point that we can be clear on is that the answers to these technical and ethical questions don't lie in a purely technical approach. And that's because these objects themselves are the results of messy human lives and behaviors. When handling these materials and the biographies associated with them, the skills that curators have in terms of appraisal, provenance research, critical engagement, and preservation are absolutely essential if a hybrid solution to these challenges are to be found. And I don't think it's just a question of data management. I think there's another set of questions here, which in some ways are more fundamental. Because part of what we need to think about when we think about these objects is their materiality. About what changes when we digitize these objects, or when we see the digital surrogates of the original objects. Are they any less human when viewed through a screen, rather than in a display case in a museum? Does the fact that they simultaneously exist as digital files, reconstituted out of the bit stream, as well as fragments of human bone and skin, which were part of a person who lived and sweated and ate and drank and slept, does this somehow make one version of them more human than the other, which in turn affords them different treatment? And how do we conceive of the past and present humanity of the digital versions of these objects? And once we know how we conceive of them, what do we do with that? So I'm going to end with a cat picture, because cat pictures make the internet a good place to be. And I'm going to say, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And if you want to read a little bit more about this topic, there's a fantastic book, which was edited by two very smart people called Chiara Palladino and Gabriel Bodard. And you can read this book on the internet and find out. And please feel free to get in touch if you have any questions, but I hope we have a little bit of time now to talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Becca, for this amazing talk. I want to make sure that people have the opportunity to ask questions. So please feel free to either use the chat or just directly address our speaker in video or through the Zoom audio, whatever you prefer.
Maybe given the number of people could raise hands in the first instance.
Yes.
Maybe people need a minute to digest. There's quite a lot to digest there.
I mean, maybe if, just to sort of fill the gap there, I can ask what's probably a very quick question, Becca. You talked a lot about the sort of human and sort of qualitative approaches to these questions and the concerns, and how none of these things are straightforward as just saying let's ban something or remove something. But I was wondering if there is any sort of hint of or movement towards any kind of technical standards for recording kinds of sensitivity or kinds of ethical problematicness in heritage data or in any other context.
So I'm going to put up my hand and say that I'm not an ontologist. So if there are ontologists out there who know better than I do about this, please correct me. But in terms of my work and looking at the kind of schema and systems that exist to describe these objects as they are in digital collections, and those would be the schema that exists when you take what's in a ledger and translate it over, there isn't necessarily an entity or a category for specifically problematic materials. So it has to be done using the keywords. So you have to, it really is a kind of qualitative approach that has to be taken at an object by object level. Also because most collections are not specifically made up of these kind of objects, right? A collection will have multiple materials in it. So you might have a collection that includes, pottery objects and things made of wood and things made of metal and beadwork, for example. And there will be something in there that contains a piece of human remains. So often what we saw when we were looking at it was you would have something that had some human hair attached to it, or a tooth, or a fragment of bone. And so it's very difficult at that level to then kind of extract those objects out. The case studies that I presented here in some ways were the easiest ones to deal with because they were the most complete in terms of it is just one piece, and that piece is kind of discrete and contained, as a skull or a fragment of skin. But oftentimes it's much more jumbled than that and much messier. So technological approaches at the moment, no, but there is some very interesting work happening using automated tools to look for these kinds of things. We know that there's a lot of experimentation happening in museum, trying to get computers to do a lot of classification and categorization of collections. And I think this is one area where it's possible that computers might be able to help us flag those materials. They're not going to be able to tell us what to do with them, though. That's what we don't yet know.
We have 2 questions. I think the first one was Martin Newman.
Hi. I'll just turn my camera on so you can see me. Shall I ask a question? Oh, I can't do that. Oh, yes, I can. I've got a series of sort of linked questions that actually does follow on quite nicely from that last answer. And I was musing on what I'm particularly interested in copyright licensing, in particular open licensing. And I was wondering, is it ever ethical to share material without attribution, even if a license permits that? And therefore, is CC0 licensing ever ethical in relation to the sorts of material we've been discussing here? Mm-hmm. And if IPR exists in the original object or image that is not and not recorded in that description. It has to be CC0 if the original material is out of copyright. So how much additional research creates new IPR, enabling it to be shared under CC BY? And does that lack of provenance information you've mentioned in many of these collections act as a trigger for the need for further research to include in the catalogue record, which will ensure it could be shared under CC BY? And your last point you just made about machines doing the cataloguing raises a further ethical question about the intellectual property. If an image, say, is catalogued by a machine, has that created new intellectual input for new and created new IPR? And if it does create new IPR, who owns that? Is it the institution? Is it the person who wrote the computer program, or the AI script in order to produce that record? Sorry, that's a lot of interlinked questions there. I'll shut up.
And I will do my best to try and provide useful answers to them. For the first one about, who owns the IPR created by a machine that does the cataloging, that is an excellent question, and I have absolutely no idea. This is going to have to be something for the lawyers, I think. What I do know is that in a recent study that came out as part of the Towards a National Collection project, cultural heritage institutions across the UK, the biggest hindrance to museums cataloging and to museums taking their catalog data and making it available online is the copyright concern. It is a huge, huge issue. And no matter where you sit on the spectrum of, it should all be open, or some of it should be open, or none of it should be open at all, the reality is that it is a huge stumbling block, and museums don't have, for the most part, the capacity to do the kind of provenance work that would be required to give all the information available or to find the owners of these orphan objects, these orphan works. So, you're going to have different copyright regimes depending on the types of institutions. For example, if you've got a painting collection, it's going to be very different perhaps to a collection of artifacts. And ownership regimes are also complicated in that context. For example, are certain objects part of the national collection? Depending on the museums that they're in the UK particularly, they may actually belong to the nation. So, there are all sorts of different structures and regimes that exist there, but ascertaining and clearing up the copyright status of a lot of materials is extremely complicated and difficult, and often prevents this material from being made available online because of these types of concerns. Now, there is also the argument that you can't copyright data. And so, does the data itself need a copyright license attached to it or not? Some people will argue yes, some people would argue no. It has been used as a justification for making data available. Whether it's ethical to ever share anything under CC0 without attribution, I think that decision, I think in the case where people have made that choice to put it out there, really rests on some level in the eye of the person who's providing the money. So to put it very bluntly, making materials available openly and as openly as possible for many institutions in Europe has become a mandate of the national funders. If you want to get money to digitize your collection, you have to put it out there under an open license. And so the kind of greater common good has been, it's been decided or agreed upon that accessibility is the greater common good, and kind of trumps the need to perhaps consider the ethics of these materials, or the ethics of the content of these sorts of materials in other ways. I'm in no position to tell a national government that what they're doing is right.
Can I come back to you very briefly on one point you said there about the licensing and copyright of data from databases. In the UK, we have a concept called database right, which is a specific part of copyright relating to information in databases, which I've got a special interest in. And yes, you can. And if you compile a database, which comes from many different sources, including third-party copyrighted material, if you combine it in such a way that it is different from the originating material, so that record is unique, not just a whole copy of something else, and it is directly relevant, and it is fully sourced, then you can claim database right over that, and you can license that database. Because I work for Historic England, and we license a lot of our database content under Open Government License, which is analogous to CC BY.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
We had someone who was going to ask a second question, but I can't see them on my screen. So if you still have the question, please unmute yourself. And we have a very, very engaged chat at the moment as well.
It was Livy who had their hand up. They put it down again. I don't know if that was deliberately.
I think there is another hand up.
Yes,
Yeah.
There's another
Would you
hand.
like to go ahead?
Hi, my name is Chelsea Rowell. I'm joining while feeling under the weather, so I'll keep my video off. I really appreciated this sort of thoughtful analysis of things that you found within Europeana collection, aggregated collection. And something you said in your talk was about how, who's responsible for making decisions both about what gets digitized and maybe what had been digitized and is removed from digital collections. I know that's sort of outside of the analysis that you did looking at things that are currently in Europeana. But I wonder if you have any insight about either insight or questions about the decision-making frameworks that different cultural heritage institutions are using. From where I sit at my institution, I feel like we sort of throw the ball around or not it or and I also feel like we don't have clear decision-making frameworks about doing this well is going to take time and resources that we don't have, and therefore an ethical action is at this time not providing digitized access. So, a wandering question, but I appreciate any perspective that you have.
Well, firstly, I'd just like to thank you for your comment about the traditional knowledge labels, which I think are a really important part of this whole framework that we've been discussing. I've seen them be used extremely effectively in certain digital contexts. And those are community-driven and community managed copyright labels, but it moves beyond copyright, right? They really are very specific about the types of reuses of certain digital materials. And I've seen them be used extremely effectively, I think, predominantly from communities in countries like Canada and Australia and New Zealand, where I think very, very interesting research is happening. So thank you for that. To go back to your other question, I think what you've described is exactly how it happens at various institutions who have to handle these sorts of objects. And I think, there are a handful of very high profile objects around which there is a lot of public discourse. So I'm going to say the word, the Berlin bronzes, for example. In some ways, the fact that these are such a visible object and that the politics around them are so clear makes them much easier to deal with. These are the kind of sexy objects in terms of the repatriation discussions, right? What are much more complicated are the objects for which there is a lot less provenance, the objects for which there is a lot less data, the objects for which there isn't much information. So that information has to be gathered before any decisions can even be thought about being made. And the article by Laura Peers that I mentioned earlier is part of a special collection of that journal, which is really, really excellent. And she describes that decision-making process as it played out at the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is where she was when that article was written. And it's such a good example of the ways in which these decisions are made and not made, and how it happens, and how, in the absence of institutional policies, which are a different thing to institutional goodwill or institutional hunches about how things should be, but to actually have a written policy is a totally different story. And how in the absence of those policies, there are often other factors that make the decision. And sometimes it's expediency, sometimes it's politics, sometimes it's money. You never really know what is going to be the factor that kind of pushes those decisions to being made. And I think a lot of institutions are extremely reluctant to have definite policies about this, because once you have something written down, then it becomes real, and then you have to do what it says on the piece of paper. And so I think a lot of institutions tend to approach these types of decisions on a case-by-case basis, which slows everything down, but can also be seen as a way of perhaps buying time to make decisions carefully. It's fraught and difficult. And I think it should be fraught and difficult. I think the position of, just give everything back is also not particularly helpful and not particularly thoughtful, and is also a decision that is made perhaps by one institution, but not necessarily by every player in a particular constellation. And it's more complicated than that. There was a case recently where it was decided that certain materials at the Pitt Rivers as well should remain at the Pitt Rivers by a community in Kenya. They actually felt that it was better for their materials to stay at the Pitt Rivers. And I think that just shows how these processes can never have a foregone conclusion. Their outcomes are never a foregone conclusion. I'm not sure if this necessarily answers your questions, but I would say if you're looking for examples of how these things happen at other institutions, the Laura Peers article, and in fact that entire special collection is very, very good.
Do we have time for the question that was asked in the chat? Okay, so we had one before that was asked, what about the consideration of data sovereignty? If the person who asked it wants to also unmute themselves, that's perfectly fine. And then we have one more at the end.
Yeah, so I just wanted to raise that in response to Martin talking about copyright and database, right? It was just that idea about data sovereignty, in that some of these objects, I'm not going to call them objects, some of these examples that you gave us, say the Ashanti example, have come from a place in a community and a culture, and things are being said about them, describing them, referencing them, whether they are sort of on that basic record that you showed us or more detailed on the actual institution's website. And perhaps the originating culture from which it was taken has some data sovereignty over what should be said about it that sort of exists longer than a period of copyright would. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's actually really interesting because in this particular case, there is more information on Europeana than there is on the Welcomes website, which is really odd because usually Europeana is where the scanty stuff is and you get a bit more if you kind of follow the links back. But absolutely, I think much like the discussion around traditional knowledge labels, the question of data sovereignty, it sort of, comes from a similar tradition, right? And the idea that not only should we allow people or source communities to have some kind of say over how the materials are managed, collected, and handled, we should allow them the same degree of sovereignty over how the data related to the materials is managed and collected. I have yet to see, at least in the cultural heritage context, an example of this kind of data sovereignty approach. I know that there is discussions about it, and it may well be happening, and I haven't seen it yet. And I would be really interested to see how it could play out. But I think this also speaks to a certain extent to some of the divides that exist within museums and other cultural heritage institutions, which is curatorial versus administrative. And so curators think about the objects and database managers think about the records, and there often isn't enough cross discussion between the two, which is, I think, precisely what would be required for this kind of exchange to take place in order to then open up the discussion around data sovereignty. Because I think, it has to be handled on so many different fronts, right? The decision has to happen within the institution, and then they have to open the doors and say to people, come in and let's start talking. But I think it's absolutely a really important point and something that I want to, I think is worth considering. Indeed. Thank you.
I just wanted to make a quick comment on that last comment. I don't know if that's necessarily always may be true, depending on the location of the institute and their relationship with, let's say, different communities or communities that are directly involved in conversations regarding their collections. So I think that might be dependent or something to interrogate more. The way that collections are cataloged in databases, there's a lot of work that's actually been done in North America with even communities and tribal nations that care for their own collections, and how that could be a model for the way other non-tribal institutes maybe handle their material culture and their collection records, both in their databases and online.
Absolutely. I think you make a really good point, and I probably wasn't clear enough. I think that particularly now with the kind of critical cataloging movement, and particularly with new stuff that is either entering collections or collections that are being revisited, there is absolutely activity that's happening there. I think in the case of this research, we were definitely looking at very old collections and collections of materials that I wouldn't call them forgotten, because I don't think that anything in a database is forgotten per se, but perhaps materials that are a little harder to trace the provenance of and to think about, maybe would be a better way to describe them. But I agree with you. And I think, in fact, North America, and this has been driven a lot by work that's happening in Canada, or has historically been happening in Canada for a little longer, but is happening in the US as well. And I hope will continue to happen in the US. There is some very exciting work. There's also really interesting work happening in South Africa. There's a project called the 500-Year Archive Project, which is looking at reclassifying some of the collections in the national collections of South Africa from a completely community-driven perspective, to the extent where the community is deciding on the metadata categories. and descriptions. So it's technically a fairly complicated project because they're basically having to build entirely new schemas to manage this stuff. But in those instances, there's sort of bottom-up work that's happening, and that is being driven by communities rather than by institutions, which is extremely exciting.
Okay. Do we have time for Libby's question, which was posted in chat? Okay. Livy, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, sorry.
Or alternative? Okay.
So my question was, what schemas do you think are essential when dealing with objects, and digitizing objects, particularly ones with cultural sensitivity attached to it? And how do you think, as a sector, we can prioritize being able to get human spirit back into our collections, particularly when a lot of the culturally sensitive objects are being collected under dubious means, and in order to prove, and I say that with air quotes, white supremacy in most cases, I won't sugarcoat it, dehumanizing global south.
Oh, I wish I could give you the answers to those questions.
Oh, sorry, I'm not expecting like one clear-cut answer. I'm just curious as to your perspective from your expertise. I don't think this is any one thing that any one person has the answer to. It's just keeps me up at night, you know.
As it should. They're really hard questions. I mean, I think it does require completely rethinking what a schema represents. And at this level, it kind of goes right to the heart of what an ontology is, right? How do you classify the world in a way that records the attributes that are significant or considered the most significant? And traditionally, that has had a very particular shape because of where these schemas were created. And, what is seen as kind of primary, what is the most important thing about any object, and then what are the kind of cascading properties that you then continue to describe. And, in libraries, this has been a discussion as well. What classification system do we use, and how we use it? And these sorts of taking a kind of liberatory approach to it is something that gets discussed a great deal. So I think it really does require rethinking the schema. And this is, in fact, where I think the 500-year archive project, which is at the University of Cape Town, is really interesting. I mean, I have seen examples of attempting to gather this sort of material through crowdsourcing, for example. So opening up collections in order to allow people to just tag materials and comment on it, and to kind of really try and source the metadata from communities in that way. There's a very interesting project that's running, I think, based in the National Library in Australia, creating what they're calling a Library of the Pacific, where there is minimal metadata coming from the institutions, and most of the metadata is coming from communities. And what's really interesting is they've even found where objects, photographic materials, for example, have been miscategorized and described incorrectly. And communities have stepped in, and individuals have stepped in and said, actually, that's not this particular practice that's being described. And you're not seeing this particular practice in the photograph. You're actually seeing a different practice. And I know that because that's my auntie sitting in that photograph doing, that piece of traditional work. And, the anxieties that have been described by people who have worked on that project is, well, what if people make a mistake? And the response is, well, is it not better to have something incorrect coming from a source community than having something that is incorrect in the record that has already been, that has been incorrect for the last 150 years? And I think it also really speaks to what our kind of ideas and definitions of like what is right and what is authoritative and not. I think maybe this is, to the second part of your question about the human spirit. This is part of it, right? It's about saying, well, there are other perspectives and there are other descriptions that are equally valid, because you can tell me what this object looks like, but if you could tell me what this object makes you feel, maybe that gives me just as powerful an understanding of the object. How does it feel in your hand? How does it feel when you look at it? How can we think about schemas that allow for space for those sorts of descriptions and interpretations, as well as just a very dry and scientific, this is made out of such and such a material, and you can see that it was an example of such and such a process to create it. Or maybe we can have systems which we know, the technology. I think that I often ask myself when I think about these things, is this an engineering problem or an ontological problem? And I think sometimes there are problems that are just engineering problems, and the engineers will be able to solve them for us. And some of the ontological problems are harder. An engineering problem is, can we think of perhaps a schema which allows us to include perhaps the sound files of the songs that were sung when particular objects were being created? Wouldn't that put a little bit more human spirit into the collection if I could hear what people sang while they made something? That might be one way to do it. And that's an engineering problem. That's not an ontological problem.
I really appreciate your insight into this. There's just one thing that, even though we're opening up our collections and trying to make it more of a community-led operation, with the history of colonialism and extraction, isn't there the risk of it becoming extractive again, where we're collecting this data and that data is then owned by the institutions, not by the communities that are fed into these systems? There have been many studies showing the lack of trust with communities that have been marginalized going into spaces because of repeated project work. Whose Cake Is It Anyway? By I want to say Elizabeth Lynch. There's a really good paper that explains this in the research that she's done behind that. And so is there a way that we can be more equitable with the ownership, not just having it so it's open to everyone to critique, to add to, but that proof of understanding? But again, that goes back into that, what is proof? Who has the authority over this? I know I'm giving impossible questions. I'm not expecting any one answer. It's just, how do we get out of the loop that we've inherited, that foundation that we've inherited to become a system, a beacon, a community hub that actually represents the histories that we say that we do?
Yeah, and I think it really requires very fundamental questions to be asked at the level of, like, where does the data center sit, right? Where's the data center that the database is stored in? Who
100%.
has access to it? Once upon a time, I was a great advocate for a totally free and open web, but I do think that there are times when we think about materials like this that actually some stuff not everything should be available. I think it's okay. I actually think it's fine if some stuff isn't available to everyone at every level. There's so much stuff out there. I don't actually think it's the end of the world. And if some things, shouldn't be seen by certain people, then it's also okay to go to the institution and ask for it, or send an email and ask for it. This is also what curators and archivists and librarians do best. They facilitate access in a multitude of ways. So, it's okay for some stuff, I think, to have a different regime of accessibility attached to it.
But then you've got the issue of the paywall, because a lot of the time when you're requesting specific kinds of data, you have to pay for the time to be able to access specific archives? What if you're in another country and you're not allowed a visa to come to this country, and yet the items of your ancestry are being held in the British Museum, for example? All of these things come into play. I know that as the museum sector, we don't have control over who can come in and out of the country, but the argument over open source, shouldn't we, how do we do that within a capitalist system? That's, I feel like, is the biggest issue that we have. How can we work in a socialist manner, in an equitable manner, when everything that we rely on is capital to do things?
Yeah. I wish I could answer this question for you. I mean, I think maybe we also need to think about what our institutions are. Where does the museum sit conceptually? Like, what is it? Is it just the behemoth behind the white marble and the database that is controlled from within it? Or do we think about, the sort of the opening up, Fiona Cameron's Liquid Museum at the kind of very fundamental level? Like, how can it stretch? How can it move? Where can it go? And I think we also need to shift the expectations of efficiency and what services perhaps are provided, and to whom, and what those priorities are as well. I mean, I agree with you. At the end of the day, I think that there's a lot of stuff that practitioners have no control over. But I also think that museums play the long game, right? And so in some ways that frees up the thinking in terms of reevaluating what can and can't be done, or at least what may or may not be possible, even if what can and can't be done is difficult in the moment.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insight. I know I've thrown you some real big curveballs there. I was not expecting any definitive answers. So thank you for engaging with that conversation.
I like having things to think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think we are at the end of our allotted time. So thank you very much to our speaker, Rebecca Kahn, and thank you very much to the many, 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 many people who attended this session. I just want to very quickly remind everybody that we have another session on March 10th with another very exciting speaker, Dipali Mathur, and with we're switching gears, but it's another very exciting topic: the limits to green growth, rematerializing UK's pathway to net zero. So please join us if you would like for that seminar as well. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you very much, Rebecca.